Once upon a time, long after the first sunrise stretched its golden fingers across the earth, and after the first man and woman walked outside the gates of Eden, a child was born. His name was Seth, and from the moment he took his first breath, he carried a weight greater than he could understand. His father, Adam, had once walked with God. His mother, Eve, had once lived in a garden where nothing withered, where every tree bore fruit without labor, where no shadows stretched in fear. But that world was lost now. Seth had never seen Eden. He had never touched its perfect fruit, never walked its peaceful paths. He had only heard the stories of a paradise shattered, of a serpent's whisper, of a choice that changed everything, and of two brothers. One whose heart had been darkened by jealousy, the other whose blood had soaked the earth. Seth had grown up in the shadow of that loss. Everyone in their small family carried it. His father, silent and sorrowful. His mother, who sometimes held him too tightly, whispering words he did not yet understand. "You are a gift," she had told him when he was still small. "God has given me another son in place of Abel." He had not known what she meant at the time, but as he grew, he began to understand. He was not just another child. He was the child of a broken world, the one who would carry the hope his parents had lost. Seth sat outside their dwelling, watching the sun sink behind the trees, painting the sky with streaks of crimson and gold. His father sat beside him, sharpening a tool against a rock, the steady sound filling the silence between them. "Tell me about Eden again," Seth said suddenly. Adam's hand stilled. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, with a deep breath, he spoke. "It was unlike anything you know," Adam murmured, his voice thick with something Seth could not name. "The trees grew without effort. The fruit was sweeter than anything you have tasted. The rivers sparkled like the morning dew, and we—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "We were not afraid." Seth glanced at him. Afraid of what? Adam's gaze drifted toward the distant hills. Of losing, of hurting, of being apart from him. Seth shifted uncomfortably. "Do you think about it all the time?" Adam let out a weary sigh. "Yes, every day." Seth frowned. He had always known his father was different from other men. He had seen things no other human had seen. He had walked with God. But he had also lost it. And Seth had only ever known the world after. "Does he still speak to you?" Seth asked quietly. Adam hesitated. "Not like before." Seth didn't ask anything else. He just sat there, listening to the sound of the night rising around them. His father's silence was answer enough. The next morning, Seth rose early, making his way to the fields where his brothers worked. Not Cain. Never Cain. Cain was gone, banished from their family, his name rarely spoken. Instead, Seth worked beside the others, those born after him, the children of Adam and Eve who had begun to spread across the land. But he was different from them. He was the one his mother called the gift. The one she looked at with eyes full of a hope he did not yet understand. "You don't have to work so hard," one of his brothers said, leaning on his tool, wiping sweat from his brow. "You always take everything too seriously, Seth." Seth smirked. "Maybe you don't take things seriously enough." His brother laughed, shaking his head. "You worry like an old man." But maybe he had to. Because deep inside him, something whispered that he was meant for more than just fields and harvests. He didn't know what yet, but he would find out. One way or another. As the sun dipped low again, Seth returned home, but as he approached, he heard voices, his parents talking in hushed tones. Curious, he stepped closer. "Eve, we must prepare him," Adam was saying. He will be the one to lead them. Lead? Seth's stomach twisted. God has given him to us for this, his mother said softly, to carry the promise, to call upon the Lord. Seth took a step back, his breath unsteady. They were talking about him, but he wasn't sure he was ready for what that meant. That night, as Seth lay awake, staring up at the stars, he thought about his father's words, about Eden, about Cain, about what it meant to be the one who carried the promise. He didn't ask for this, but maybe, just maybe, he was ready to embrace it, and as sleep claimed him, he didn't feel afraid anymore. Because he knew his story was only beginning. The morning sun stretched long shadows across the earth as Seth walked alone beyond the fields, the soft crunch of soil beneath his feet grounding him in the quiet stillness of dawn. His father's words from the night before still echoed in his mind. He will be the one to lead them, the one to carry the promise. But what did that mean? Seth exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He had never thought much about the future beyond the fields, beyond tending the land and gathering harvests. That was what life had always been: work, survival, another day rising and falling. But now, it felt as though something greater loomed over him, something unseen, yet impossibly heavy. A leader, a voice for the people. A connection to the God his father once walked beside, but how could he carry something he had never seen? The scent of roasting meat filled the air as Seth returned home, his mother tending to the fire, her hands steady as she prepared the evening meal. She smiled when she saw him, but there was something in her gaze, something knowing. "You heard us last night," she said softly. Seth hesitated, then nodded. "I did." She motioned for him to sit, setting aside her work. "Does it trouble you?" "I just don't understand," Seth admitted, looking down at his hands, calloused from years of labor. "Why me? I wasn't the firstborn. I wasn't supposed to be the one to carry anything." Eve's face softened. "And yet, God chose you." Seth swallowed. "I don't know what he wants from me." His mother reached out, placing a hand over his. "Neither did we once." She paused, her expression unreadable. "When your father and I left Eden, we did not know how to begin again. We only knew what we had lost. We were broken, ashamed, and alone. But God did not abandon us. Even in our sorrow, He still gave us life, and He gave us you." Seth exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "But I don't even know what it means to lead. I don't know how to be what you and Father expect me to be." Eve smiled, her touch gentle. "You don't have to be your father, Seth. You only have to be faithful." Seth felt a lump rise in his throat. "But what if I fail?" Her expression was unwavering. "Then He will show you the way." That night, as the stars stretched across the heavens, Seth found himself wandering the hills, the cool wind whispering against his skin. He needed to think. He needed to understand. "Why me?" he whispered to the night. Silence. And then, a memory. His father's voice, long ago, telling him of the day he had first seen God's face. He was light, Seth, brighter than the sun, yet not blinding. His voice was deep, yet gentle, and when he spoke, it was as if the whole world was listening. Seth closed his eyes. He had never known the voice of God. But maybe, if he listened hard enough, maybe one day he would. And maybe that would be enough. For now, the days passed, and Seth tried to push aside the questions in his heart, but the weight of the promise never left him. One evening, as he sat sharpening a blade near the fire, his father approached. You've been quiet, Adam noted. Seth didn't look up. I've been thinking. Adam sat beside him, watching the fire flicker. About the promise? Seth hesitated. About what it means to follow a God I've never seen. His father was silent for a long time. Then, in a voice quieter than usual, he said, I know what it is to walk with him, Seth, but I also know what it is to walk without him. He exhaled, eyes distant. I lost something I can never get back, and I have spent every day longing for what I once had, but you will know him in a different way. Seth frowned. How? Adam's gaze met his, steady. By calling on his name. Seth let the words settle, unsure if he understood them yet. But something deep inside him stirred, a quiet whisper, a promise of its own. And he knew. His journey had only just begun. The morning air was thick with the scent of damp earth, a reminder that the rains had passed through in the night. Seth walked among the trees, his thoughts heavy, his heart restless. His father's words lingered in his mind, turning over and over like a river smoothing a stone. Call on his name. It sounded simple. But how could he call on a God he had never seen? He had watched his father for years, watched Adam kneel in silence, his head bowed, his lips moving in quiet prayers. His mother, too, would whisper words of thanks, her face turned toward the heavens as if waiting for something unseen, but Seth had never heard a voice in return. Never seen a sign that God was listening, and yet something deep inside him longed to try. By the time he returned home, the others had gathered around the fire. His younger brothers worked with the tools Adam had made, shaping wood, preparing weapons for the hunt. His sisters tended to the food, their laughter carrying on the breeze. It was an ordinary evening, but Seth's heart was unsettled. He sat beside his father, watching as Adam carved a piece of stone, his movements slow and practiced. How did you know? Seth asked suddenly. Adam didn't stop working. Know what? That God was real, Seth said. How did you know he was there before you ever saw him? Adam paused then, the tool still in his hands. He turned his gaze toward Seth, his expression unreadable. I did not wonder, he said simply. I walked with him. Seth clenched his jaw. That was the difference between them. His father had seen God, had heard his voice, had known him in ways Seth never would. He had no doubts because he had no reason to doubt. But you don't walk with him anymore, Seth pointed out, his voice quieter. Adam's expression darkened. No, he admitted, I do not. Seth hesitated. Then how do you know he still hears you? His father exhaled, setting his work aside. Because even after all that we lost, he did not take his presence from us. He did not abandon us. And even now, I feel him. I do not need to see him to know he is near. Seth sat with those words, letting them settle into his heart. Maybe faith wasn't about seeing. Maybe it was about knowing. That night, when the others had gone to sleep, Seth stepped out into the quiet. The stars stretched endlessly above him, glittering against the vast darkness. He had always thought the night was empty, but tonight he felt something else, something more. He took a deep breath, and then, for the first time in his life, he spoke. God, he whispered, his voice barely above the wind. I don't know if you hear me. I don't even know if I'm doing this right, but my father says you are there, that you still watch over us, that you have not abandoned us. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. I want to know you, he said. Not just the stories, not just the things my father remembers. I want to know you. Silence. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of the earth with it. Seth closed his eyes, listening, waiting. He did not hear a voice. He did not see a vision. But for the first time, he felt something stir within him, something warm, something real. And in that moment, he knew he had been heard, and that was enough. The next morning, as he walked toward the fields, he saw his mother watching him. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You prayed," she said. Not a question, but a knowing statement. Seth met her gaze, something steady inside him now. Yes. A slow smile spread across her face. "And?" He inhaled, looking toward the horizon where the sun had just begun to rise. "And I think..." He listened. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder. "He always does." Seth nodded. For the first time in his life, he believed it, and now he was ready to follow. The morning air carried the scent of fresh earth as Seth walked toward the fields, his feet pressing into the damp soil. The land stretched out before him, golden with harvest, a reminder that life continued, that God's provision never ceased. But today, something felt different. Today, he felt different. Ever since that night, the night he had whispered his first prayer into the silence, Seth had felt a quiet stirring within him. He could not explain it, but it was there, steady as the rising sun. God had heard him. And that changed everything. As he worked, one of his younger brothers approached, leaning on his staff. "You've been different lately," his brother said, watching him closely. Seth smirked. "How so?" "You don't brood as much," his brother teased. "You used to look like you carried the weight of the whole world." Seth chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe because I finally realized I don't have to." His brother raised an eyebrow. "And what does that mean?" "It means I'm not alone in this," Seth said simply. "We never have been." His brother frowned slightly, as if mulling over the words. "You sound like father." Seth shrugged. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." His brother didn't argue, but Seth could tell he was thinking. That was enough. Later that evening, as the fire crackled and shadows danced along the walls of their home, Adam gathered the family together. It was a time of rest, of sharing stories, of remembering the past. But tonight Seth felt the urge to speak. He hesitated at first, glancing at his father. But when Adam met his eyes, there was a silent understanding between them. So Seth took a breath and spoke. "I prayed," he said, his voice steady, "for the first time." The firelight flickered in his mother's eyes as she smiled. His siblings exchanged glances, some curious, others thoughtful. "And?" Adam asked. Seth exhaled. "And I know he heard me." Silence stretched between them, but it was not empty. It was filled with something greater, something deeper. Then his mother nodded. "You have begun the most important journey, Seth." His youngest sister frowned. "But did he speak to you?" Seth shook his head. "Not in the way father heard him. Not with words, but I felt him." His father leaned forward. "That is faith, my son, to know he is near even when you cannot see him." Seth nodded. For the first time, he truly understood. The days passed, and with each one, Seth's faith grew stronger. He found himself looking at the world differently, seeing God's hand in the way the river never ceased to flow, in the way the crops rose from the soil, in the way the stars returned to the sky every night without fail. And others began to notice. His siblings started asking questions. His brothers listened more intently when he spoke. His mother watched him with quiet pride. Even Adam seemed lighter, as if some unseen burden had shifted. Seth wasn't just hearing about God anymore. He was leading others toward him. And maybe this was what it meant to carry the promise. to pass it on, to ensure that God's name would never be forgotten. Not in their family, not in the world, not ever. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Seth stood at the edge of the fields, gazing at the vast sky stretching endlessly above him. His father stepped beside him, silent for a long moment. "You remind me of Abel," Adam finally said, his voice low. Seth turned to him, surprised. His father rarely spoke of Abel. Adam exhaled slowly. "He had a heart like yours, one that longed to know God, to serve Him, to walk in His ways." Seth swallowed hard. "Do you miss him?" Adam's gaze drifted toward the fading light. "Every day." He sighed. "But I believe, if Abel were here, he would be proud of you." Seth felt a lump rise in his throat, but he nodded. "I hope so." Adam placed a hand on his shoulder. "Keep calling on his name, Seth. Keep leading. This family, this world, will need men like you." Seth looked out at the land before him, at the hills that stretched into the unknown. He didn't know what the future held. But he did know one thing: God was with him. And that was enough. The cool night air wrapped around Seth as he stood at the edge of the river, his bare feet sinking slightly into the damp earth. The stars reflected on the water's surface, shimmering like scattered jewels. He had always loved this place, a quiet refuge where the world felt still, where the burdens of life seemed lighter. But tonight he was not alone. Behind him a group had gathered, his brothers, his sisters, their children. Some watched him in silence, their expressions uncertain. Others looked expectant, waiting. Seth took a deep breath. "This is the beginning," he reminded himself. "This is what I was called to do." He turned to face them, his heart steady. "You all know the stories," he began, "of Eden, of the life our father and mother once had. You know of the fall, the curse, the sorrow that came with it." He let his gaze sweep over them, his voice calm but firm. "But you also know of His mercy." A murmur passed through the group. One of his younger brothers shifted uncomfortably. "But we have never seen Him, Seth," he said. "Not the way Father did. How can we know for sure?" Seth nodded. He understood the doubt. He had once wrestled with it himself. "Neither have I," he admitted. "Not with my eyes. But I know He is near, because I have called upon His name, and I have felt Him answer." A hush fell over them. Seth took a step forward. "Our father once walked with God. He knew Him in a way that we never will. But does that mean we are forgotten?" He shook his head. "No. It means that we must seek Him in our way. We must call upon His name." A few nodded, considering his words. Then his sister spoke. "And what if He does not answer?" Seth's eyes softened. "He already has." She frowned. "How?" Seth gestured to the world around them. "In the rivers that never stop flowing, in the sun that rises without fail, in the food that springs from the ground, in the life He gives us every day." He paused. "We do not need to see Him to know He is there. We need only to seek Him." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, one by one, they began to kneel. The youngest children at first, their small hands clasped, their whispers uncertain but eager. Then the women, their eyes closed, their lips moving in silent prayers. Then his brothers, their heads bowed, their doubts melting into faith. Seth watched, his chest tightening. This was it. This was what his father had spoken of. This was the beginning of a generation that would seek God. He knelt beside them, pressing his hands into the soil, And for the first time, he did not pray alone. The days passed, and something shifted in their family. They began to pray openly, together. They spoke of God's goodness, not just as a memory of their parents, but as a truth they had come to know for themselves. Seth saw it in the way his brothers worked together, in the way his sisters sang songs of praise as they tended the fields. He saw it in the way the children laughed, in the way his mother's face softened as she watched them, in the way his father, though still carrying the weight of the past, stood a little taller. Faith had taken root, and it was growing. One evening, Adam called Seth to him. They sat beneath a great tree, the branches swaying gently above them. "You have done well, my son," Adam said, his voice thick with emotion. Seth looked at him surprised. "I have only done what you told me to do." Adam smiled. "No, Seth, you have done more." He exhaled, staring out at the land before them. "When I lost Eden, I thought I had lost everything. I thought my children would never know God as I had. But I was wrong." He turned to Seth. "Because of you, they will know him." Seth felt a lump rise in his throat. "I only wanted them to seek him." Adam nodded. "And they will, for generations to come." Silence stretched between them, but it was not empty. It was filled with peace. For the first time in years, Adam did not look like a man burdened by loss. He looked like a man who had found hope, and Seth knew his purpose had been fulfilled. The days turned into seasons, and the seasons into years. Seth watched as his family grew, as children were born, as his brothers and sisters became mothers and fathers themselves. He saw the world change, saw the land stretch farther than he had ever imagined, saw the people multiply and spread across the valleys and hills. But through it all, one thing remained constant. They called on the name of the Lord. What had begun as whispered prayers in the night had now become a way of life. They prayed in the morning, before the day's labor. They thanked him when the harvest was plentiful. They cried out to him when sickness came, when grief struck, when their strength failed. And God was faithful. Even though they had never seen him, even though the gates of Eden remained forever closed, he was with them. Seth saw it in the way the earth provided for them, in the way the rivers never ran dry, in the way new life came with every season. He saw it in the laughter of children, in the kindness of his brothers, in the peace that rested over their family, and he knew their faith would outlive him. It would not end with him. It would be passed on, from father to son, from mother to daughter, from generation to generation. This was the promise he had carried. This was what God had called him to do. One evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of red, Seth sat beside his father for what he knew would be the last time. Adam was old now. His once strong hands were thin, his movements slower, his breath shallower. He had lived longer than any man after him would, had seen more than any of them could comprehend. But tonight, there was no sorrow in his face, only peace. "Do you remember Eden?" Seth asked softly. Adam smiled faintly, his eyes distant. "I could never forget it." Seth hesitated. "Do you think we will ever see it again?" Adam's gaze met his steady. "One day, my son. One day, he will make all things new." Seth swallowed, nodding slowly. "I believe that." Adam reached out, his wrinkled hand gripping Seth's own. "And that is why I have no fear, because you have led them well, and you will continue to do so." Seth held his father's hand tightly, knowing this would be the last time. "Thank you," Seth whispered, "for teaching me." Adam chuckled weakly. "No, Seth. You have taught me. The stars began to appear in the sky above them, their light steady and unchanging. Adam's breath slowed, and then he was gone. Seth closed his eyes, letting the silence settle around him. The first man had returned to the dust, but his legacy would live on. And now Seth would lead them. The years continued, and Seth became the father of many. His children, and their children, and their children after them, they all called upon the name of the Lord, even as the world darkened, even as sin spread through the earth, even as men forgot the name of God. Seth's descendants remembered, because Seth had led them well, because faith had been planted in their hearts, and it would not be uprooted. And so the promise continued. A line of men stretching through the generations, a line of faith, unbroken, a legacy that could not be erased. And one day, from his descendants, from the sons of Seth, would come a child, born under a different sky, in a world still waiting for redemption. A child who would open the gates of Eden once more, a child who would bring his salvation. And when that day came, the faith of Seth would live on, because God's promise never failed, not then, not now, not ever.